This lesson is going to be about our second marriage principle. We already heard our first one, which is love is a choice, not just a feeling. So if you can keep your promises and your commitment to your spouse, then you can have a lifelong marriage. But if you want to have a fulfilling, healthy marriage, then trust needs to be at the foundation. So just like our last video, my husband and I are going to share the talking points. You guys use that workbook. Talk about it then with your spouse, your marriage mentors, or your small group.
Let's start with a definition of trust. According to the dictionary, trust is relying on the integrity or ability of another person. Now notice what the emphasis is in this definition. There's an emphasis on the other person. If you're going to trust somebody, husbands, if you're going to trust your wife, wives, if you're going to trust your husband, it has a lot to do with their integrity, ability, character. So that's really important to understand as we talk about trust in this lesson, and as you talk about trust with your spouse or with your mentors, is to talk about how important it is that trust is about character, integrity of a person, so that you're a trustworthy person. And that really leads to our second marriage principle. Here's how we say it.
Trust is earned, not freely given. See, this is what happens a lot of times in relationships. If we don't really understand what trust is about, which is about the other person's integrity or ability, then we might be doling out trust to people that haven't earned it, that don't deserve it. That's why the second principle is so important for us to understand. Trust is something that has to be earned, not just freely given out. I'm sure all of us have examples of times that we've trusted someone that turned out to really burn us in some way, and that happens in marriages as well. So make sure that you think about trust in the right way, and remember that it should be about earning it all the time. That's why one of your main jobs as a spouse is to prove to be trustworthy. You know, we can't make the mistake in marriage where we just say, just trust me. Don't worry about it, just trust me. Those are empty words that don't mean anything because as we've learned at the definition of trust, it's all about what the other person's bringing to the table. It's good to think of it this way. Think about your bank account. You have to be making deposits, right? Your paychecks need to be going in order to pay your bills, to make those withdrawals. And what happens when we start withdrawing more than we are putting in? We have an overdraft account. It's the same thing with trust. We need to be making deposits every day into that trust account in our marriage so that when a mistake happens and a withdrawal has to occur, we've got enough trust in that account to cover that mistake and to then start to build again.
Look at this verse from Deuteronomy. This is in the Old Testament, and it shows that God models this principle of being trustworthy. It says, "Understand that the Lord your God is indeed God. He is the faithful God who keeps his covenant for 1,000 generations and lavishes his unfailing love on those who love him and obey his commands." See, the reason we're showing you this verse is we want you to know that even God doesn't just demand our trust. You know, nowhere in the Bible does God say, just trust me, just trust me, just trust me. He earns our trust. He's a trustworthy God. He is faithful. That's another word for trustworthy. He's faithful. And it's really good for us to understand, husbands and wives, we need to be faithful too. We can't just demand that our spouse trust us. We have to earn it, just like God has earned it for us in our own lives. Because trust is something to be earned. It's not just something you freely give, even with God. So it's the same in our marriages.
So let's look at 3 characteristics of trust. Trust is reactive, measurable, and time-consuming. So let's take each one of those and explain them for a second. The first one, reactive. Here's what that means. Let me give it in an example. If your husband has had a relationship with a coworker of the opposite sex that's made you a little bit nervous, you've had some conversations, you've said, I don't like this doesn't seem healthy, and it doesn't seem right. Your husband's heard that, he's saying, okay, I'll try to be better. So the reactive piece of trust is you're gonna be watching to see what your spouse is doing to show you that he's being trustworthy with the coworker. So you're gonna react to his behaviors. So that's very important to know about trust. You're reacting to what you see. Okay, now the measurable piece ties right with that. The measurable piece of trust is that when you say to your husband, okay, if you're earning my trust in this area with your coworker, then you will show me your phone every day you get home from work. You will stop contacting this person or talking to him through email. You will call me during the lunch break so I know what you're doing and who you're with. Those would be specific behaviors that your husband would choose to do to show you his trustworthiness. So it would be measurable. If he's doing those things, then you can look at that and say, and react to those specific behaviors and say, okay, this is working. You're starting to earn my trust. Or if your spouse said he was going to do those things and then doesn't, and you pick up his phone and you see texts or you see emails, or he's not calling you during the lunch break, then you can look at that and say, you're not showing me in your behaviors that you're making any changes, and therefore trust isn't being earned. And here's the last piece. Trust is time consuming. It's going to take time to earn it, especially if there's been a breach in trust. You have to give it time for these opportunities for behaviors to change and for you to react to what you see to start building that trust back up into that account. So remember, trust is reactive, trust is measurable, and trust is time consuming.
Okay, one last thing. Trust is different than forgiveness in marriage, but they're both must-haves. We always like to talk about forgiveness when we talk about trust because they kind of go hand in hand, even though they're different things. You know, trust is reactive. You react in trust. You know, God says you have to earn trust, right? A person has to be trustworthy. But forgiveness is different. The Bible says that we should forgive. We should freely forgive. So we shouldn't freely trust even in marriage, but we should freely forgive even in marriage. And the reason that we like to say this right here, and we want to close with this thought for today's lesson, is because when you're trying to rebuild trust in a marriage, you know, in that example my wife gave, if that example really hit home for you, you're gonna need this spouse that is trying to trust the husband or wife more now. That spouse has got to extend some forgiveness so that you can move forward in trust, right? So sometimes you have to be proactive in forgiving, but at the same time saying, now I still want you to earn my trust. I forgive you, but as we move forward, I want you to earn my trust now in that area again. So forgiveness is proactive, trust is reactive, but they're both must-haves in marriage. Now, if you want more information on trust or forgiveness, make sure to check out some of those resources in the lesson resources for today. But for right now, why don't you use that workbook and talk about this now with your marriage mentor or your small group.